Welcome to Casual Politics, John Barron. Thank you very much for accepting this with Casual Politics.
Not at all.
And thank you very much, and I'm very grateful to you. You need no introduction, you've been a member of Parliament since 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been quite very outspoken about some issues against war in Iraq, against war in Libya, against war in Syria, and also about your Euroscepticism about the way that the EU is operating at the moment. But David Cameron, before going and starting his renegotiations, he said that this is a lifetime opportunity for our generation to have a say about the EU. So do you think that is it a good thing to give a voice to people to cast their votes on whether or not to remain within the EU? Or
yes, I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. When I helped to lead the campaign for a referendum in the last Parliament, for a referendum in this where we are now, it was because we recognised that when we last voted on our membership was many, many years ago, back in the early 70s. And since then, the EU, it was then called the EEC, then it became the EC, now it's the EU, has changed so fundamentally that I think this generation deserves its chance to say, should we still belong to this very different organisation that we changed, or that we joined in the early 70s. And it's changed more than many other international organisations we belong to. So I think it is right we've had this referendum. We had to fight tooth and nail to get it. The Prime Minister didn't want to give it to us, but we won that battle in the last Parliament within the Conservative Party, and that's why I think I'm very pleased, and many others are, that we now have this opportunity to say whether we as a country want to remain in the EU or not.
But it seemed that you had already made up your decision actually how to cast your vote, and now you didn't wait unlike your colleagues like Boris Johnson till the Prime Minister finishes his renegotiations and then to say which side are you on.
I think you need to check your records. I've always been a Eurosceptic, I would agree, but I reserved my position until I'd heard what the Prime Minister had negotiated. And it was only when he came back and told us what he had managed to negotiate that I finally said, right, I am now declaring my position, and that is I will be campaigning for us to leave the EU, because the concessions, if you like, he's negotiated are so minor that they do not represent a fundamental change in our relationship with the EU. This country still cannot stop any unwanted taxes, regulations or directives from the EU. And I think it's very important that we remain a sovereign nation and able to make these decisions ourselves. We want to get on with Europe. We want good relations with all our neighbours. But I'm very positive about Europe. I'm just not positive about the EU, particularly when you consider that it is in the economic global slow lane with high unemployment rates to match. And that is just but one example and one reason why I will be campaigning for us to leave.
And you mentioned taxes. What taxes do we as taxpayers pay for the EU?
Well, I mean, we've had a recent debate with regards to tampon tax.
But it's a minor issue, isn't it?
Not for women, it's not. No, you've got to be careful. You're going to get in trouble with your female viewers. It's not a minor issue. The EU has imposed a tax. We would not impose it in this country, but we have no right to abolish it.
But
so that is well, but that is there are others as well. But that is one very good and recent example of where the EU said this will be taxed. We did not want to tax it in Parliament, and they've taxed it. And we cannot actually say no to that tax because we've signed up. It's a very good example of a tax that has been forced upon us. So, and then when you consider also the fact that the EU is costing this country, we're one of the few contributors, and it's costing 10 billion, not million, billion pounds a year. That is equivalent to £300 to every household. We could ad infinitum now, give each household £300 a year if we came out of the EU.
But Lady Thatcher, she still managed to get a rebate from the EU.
Yes, but that's been whittled away somewhat. Tony Blair gave it away, gave an element of it away for promise of reform of the common agricultural policy, which never came about, funny enough. So I think we've got to be careful here. One wants good relations with Europe. It's just that I think the EU, because of its reliance on over-taxation, over-regulation, over-bureaucracy, Europe is in the global economic slowly. It has high unemployment rates. I mean, the average EU unemployment rate is far higher than it is here, and that's the average. But if you go
especially
south,
youth unemployment.
well, particularly, I was going to say. I mean, I was trying to be fair and talk about general unemployment. General unemployment is much higher on the continent than it is here, but youth unemployment in certain countries it's approaching 50%. I mean, that is unsustainable. I mean, you are wasting the potential of the youth in those countries because unemployment is so high. That is a direct result of the fact that the EU has imposed austerity on those countries because they've signed up to the single currency called the euro. So those countries cannot depreciate their currency and trade their way out. They cannot control their interest rates because that's controlled by the EU. And that is why, very major reasons why, they are in such a mess.
But we're not signed up to the single currency.
No, we're not. But
we're not part of the Schengen Agreement.
No, but you have to be careful there because there isn't one example in the world where you've had monetary union without fiscal union. And the whole tendency of the Eurozone will be for closer fiscal and political union to make monetary union, the single currency, work. Now, they are going to have to use the institutions of the EU. And therefore, this choice at this referendum is not simply out and in. It's out, or do we remain on the conveyor belt, the escalator, towards ever closer union? And that is what is written in the treaties, ever closer union.
And they managed to opt that out, an ever closer union. We're not signed to that one.
That is interesting because one, is it legally binding? Anything outside a treaty is not legally binding.
It will be after the referendum. That's why the Prime Minister said.
Yes, but if you look at what the European Court of Justice has had a habit of doing, it's reversing these things. But even if it was legally binding, it's not irreversible. So actually you've got to be very, very careful there. What you've seen since we've joined the EU, since the early 1970s, is ever closer union, and the EU getting itself into more and more of a mess. Now there's a whole world to trade out there with. We belong to all the major organisations. We sit at the top table of all the major organisations. We do not have to belong to the EU, particularly when you consider very high unemployment rates that the EU has. So we have a clear choice in this referendum. And as for those who say, but trade would be difficult with the EU if we left, that is simply not true. We run a massive trade deficit with the EU. They send more goods to us than we send to them, so it's in their interest for trade to continue. The Germans will still want to sell us their cars, the French their wine, etc. But so our trade surplus is with the rest of the world. But even if they did cut up rough a little bit, WTO, World Trade Organization rules mean that they could not slap tariffs higher than what's called the most favoured nation status, which means it would be no more than 3 or 4%.
But there's a concern about protectionism, that we might enter into a protectionism after we left the EU.
World Trade Organization won't allow it. Don't forget, all countries, not just the EU, are governed by the WTO. So protectionism is not on the agenda. If anything, trade barriers are being broken down, as you're seeing in Asia, you're seeing with TTIP, you're seeing with many other countries. And one other thought for you. If many other countries can trade with the EU very profitably, from outside the EU, there's no reason why Britain couldn't, particularly such an industrious and bright country that we are. I think those who think that we are doomed if we leave or we won't do as well, sometimes talk the country down too much. We have great potential. Just look at our youth, look at our scientists, look at everything. Great potential, and businesses have made it clear. What's interesting about this referendum is that a lot of businesses said it won't make a lot of difference whether we're in or out.
And you know that what businesses don't like is uncertainty, and for sure this EU referendum will create a lot of uncertainty in the market.
No evidence of that at all. If you remember, big business, certain companies were saying us not joining the euro would cause uncertainty. And look what happened. Massive inward investment into the UK, more than any other country. We then had those same businesses say that the announcement of a referendum in the last Parliament a couple of years ago would cause uncertainty.
But pound has started to lose its value. And,
well, it's depreciated.
And the evidence is when Boris Johnson announced that he will campaign to leave the EU, and then we saw that actually just collapse.
Yeah, yes, but there's no. But currencies swing about all over the place. Pound has been strong because other currencies have been weak. We're probably going through a bit of a phase where other currencies are catching up.
But as it's
let me
lowest level,
let me suggest to you, a bit of a weakening currency when we've had quite a strong currency is no bad thing because it helps growth. It makes our goods cheaper to export. So actually, it's not a bad thing, short term, and could actually add to growth. So actually, referendum could be doing us a power of good.
There's an awful lot of uncertainty as well, and mainly it's about expats living abroad and foreigners who are already living here, and they're all very worried about this referendum, and they're always wondering what will happen to them if we decided to leave the EU. Could you tell us roughly what will happen to those who are already living here or Britons who are already living abroad?
Well, I mean, we would all get on. I mean, you know, you're creating a very dark picture.
Are you 100% sure about that?
Well, yes, because what are we going to do? We're not going to go to war with people. You're painting a very dark picture, Amir, of I mean, I can see where you're coming from, and I can see you've made up your mind already, but the bottom line is that people will get on. We got on with the peoples of Europe long before the EU turned up. We were, if you like, exceptionally tolerant nation, and we always have been when it came to asylum seekers, minorities being persecuted on the continent. They all came to Britain, if you remember. So don't disregard all that hundreds of years of history. The EU, we have been getting on with the peoples of Europe long before the EU turned up. I think what we should be doing instead is focusing on the issue of sovereignty when it comes to the EU, and you haven't asked about that, because I think that is important. You know, you've got to make a decision. Do you want a little bit more control or a lot more control? Do you want to govern yourself in cooperation, in harmony with others, or do you want laws and taxes being imposed on you? And we talked about the tampon tax, which is one very recent example, which was fought on the floor of the House of Commons, where Parliament said, no, we don't want this tax, it's an EU tax. But women throughout the country are now paying more courtesy of an EU tax.
But many of your Eurosceptic colleagues, including Andrew Rossendale, they supported the government's bill on tampon tax.
Well,
including Peter Byrne as well. And you mentioned sovereignty.
But if you don't mind me saying, Amir, that's not a valid argument. You'll always get MPs on both sides of a debate, but the fact remains that the EU tried to impose, or has imposed, a tax on this country which we do not want.
And you mentioned sovereignty. May I ask you that over the past 5 years, how many legislations in the House of Commons they were discussed in the House were related to the EU? As long as I'm concerned, only 4 legislations that were discussed about the EU over the past 5 years. What's your
Well, I mean, businesses, go and talk to businesses, for example. Businesses will tell you that a good chunk of their regulations comes from the EU.
No, sovereignty of the Parliament.
But that's what regulations you give businesses comes down to sovereignty. You don't forget, it is Brussels telling British businesses that they must do this, that, or the other.
What about sovereignty?
Well, that is sovereignty of Parliament. It is very simply sovereignty of Parliament. British businesses should be subject to British Parliament. They're not, when it comes to a lot of these regulations. We've talked about the tampon tax. The EU forcing a tax as one example on this country, which we did not want. We are now paying more for tampons because the EU said we can tax that. That is wrong. You're looking at other examples where we have legislation coming through and other bits and pieces. But it comes back to this point, if I may suggest to you. whether you give prisoners voting rights is another example. These are all sorts of things. It comes down to this fact: do we want to retain the ability to govern ourselves or not? We want to cooperate. We want good neighbourly relations, but we had good neighbourly relations long before the EU came along. And perhaps let me turn this round a little bit, if I may, Emir. I think there are tensions in Europe at the moment, and those tensions are partly because the EU has proved to be a complete shambles when it comes to its immigration policy. It seriously underfunded the refugee camps in Syria. The United Nations has actually said so. That is a crime, in my view. Britain and the US, the UK and the US, actually did more than their fair share, but the rest of Europe didn't. And I think that's one reason why you're seeing
Germany did even more than the UK, accepting over 1 million of migrants.
Oh, yes, they've accepted them in.
Steps.
They've accepted
Yes.
them in, but you could argue that could create just as much of a problem, because in just opening the doors, it has created all sorts of tensions with neighbours.
But you can't say that no one did anything apart from the UK.
No, I'm not saying that.
And
You didn't.
US.
With respect, you weren't listening. I was saying contributions to the refugee camps. There was a lot of refugee camps established. I mean, Lebanon, I think I'm right in saying a quarter.
Turkey
or a third.
and Turkey
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. If I may just finish, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey have all done a lot, but they needed help with funding, because if you don't properly resource refugee camps, they become hotbeds of extremism. And it's absolutely wrong that people are asked to live in terrible conditions. The EU underfunded it. The United Nations has said so. And can you blame people wanting a better life by moving on if their refugee camps are, etc., etc.? Now listen, my friend, I've got to vote.
Okay, there you are. Well, thank you. There
Not
you
at
are.
all.
At least we got to